Clover Studio was only around for a few short years before Capcom shut them down, and while God Hand was their last game, it would be Okami that would be considered their best.
After the first Beautiful Joe, Capcom renamed Team Beautiful to Clover Studio, and it used it to focus on creating new intellectual properties for Capcom. After Beautiful Joe, Okami was created as what was called a brand-focused product, whatever that means. Okami was a critical success, but a bust in sales. It sold about 1.33 million copies since the game's release, and that includes the PS2, Wii, and PlayStation Network HD re-release. 1.33 million copies in 8 years is not good. More recent games that were nowhere near received as well as Okami have sold more. After Okami failed to bring in the money that Capcom hoped, they pretty much lost all faith in Clover, Okami being the one and only nail in the coffin and God Hand lowering the casket into the grave. And the resignation of, and I'll probably butcher these names, Atsushi Inaba, Hideki Kamiya, and Shinji Mikami in 2006 didn't help, but they left to start Platinum Games. Their resignations were part of two others, Yoshiki Okamoto in 2003 and Keiji Inafune in 2010, citing that Capcom management had a strict rule that 70 to 80% of their games had to be sequels to existing properties, but the actual number was closer to 100%.
That makes way too much sense.
The idea for the game spawned from wanting to involve a lot of nature and creating a demo movie of a wolf running through a forest with flowers popping up behind it. The development team started throwing their own ideas, but the game became more of a simulation and was called boring. Eventually they settled on the gameplay that we see in the final product. The art style was inspired by Japanese watercoloring and wood carving of the ukiyo style. Originally, they planned on using a photorealistic style, but changed to a colorful sumie style, so that way they could portray Amaterasu's connection with nature and the task of restoring it, and the PS2's hardware had a hard time rendering photorealism, although that didn't stop Gran Turismo 4. Switching to the watercolors where the celestial brush came in, wanting the player to get involved with the game's art instead of just looking at it. The original enemies were dinosaurs but switched to demons, because that makes sense considering how much Japanese mythology is in this game. Translating the game was very time consuming as there were 1,500 pages of script to go through, and they had to localize certain things, like Amaterasu's nickname Amako being translated to Ami. There was a puzzle that was completely changed, and different mannerisms for the characters so it would make sense for Western audiences.
And it's sad that so much work went into this, and even to this day, it still hasn't paid off, especially for a game as critically acclaimed as this.
Graphically, the game is amazing. The watercolor and ink wash styles makes it look like you're playing with a painting. The human characters are pretty cartoony looking, as are the animal characters. The only character that looks realistically like what it is Amaterasu, who looks and moves like a real wolf, although her jaw is almost always open and doesn't express any facial expressions beyond blank stare and aggression. I've had dogs my whole life, mostly German Shepherds, and I can tell you that dogs, which are a subspecies of gray wolves, do have their own personalities, emotions, and convey them through facial expressions. I'm not criticizing the developers for not giving Amaterasu more personality and facial expressions. I'm just saying that it's a missed opportunity to make animals in video games more realistic. After all, we really don't see animals portrayed realistically in games that often, and the technology was there to do it. The music is pretty good, and I'm guessing that it's true to the time period that it's supposed to be based on.
And I'm not basing that assumption based on all the anime that I've watched over the years. Okay, I am.
The gameplay is very much like what we've seen from the Legend of Zelda series. The game's director, Hideki Kamiya, is a fan of the Zelda series and admitted that the base gameplay was influenced by the Zelda games. So you can say that this game is Capcom's own Legend of Zelda that isn't the Minish Cap, Oracle of Ages and Seasons, or Four Swords on the GBA. However, it's not exactly like the Zelda games. The combat is more action-based, relying on combos, and fighting takes place in closed arenas, and you can escape by attacking cracks in the walls. Along the way, you'll get different weapons, then you can either equip them as a main or a sub, and the weapons will have different effects depending on how they're equipped. You can get a long-range fireball attack, a shield, ink bullets, just to name a few. The game is very much like an RPG, and while you don't level in the traditional sense, you gain praise by restoring the land and helping people, which works like experience points, and you can put them into hit points, ink wells, or a food and money sack.
I question why a wolf would need to buy things from a store, but I've seen seagulls steal chips from a convenience store, so what do I know what animals are thinking?
One of the main parts of the gameplay is the Celestial Brush, allowing you to pause the game and create a sun, moon, make plants bloom, repair bridges, and a lot of other things. It's essentially your magic abilities, and the ink pots are the equivalent to mana or magic points, whatever term you prefer. And the brush strokes are all pretty much the same except for that they're context sensitive. Depending on how a line is used, it will create vines to pull you or other things to floating flowers, or will send water or fire from one place to another. A circle will make a sun in the sky, make plants bloom if done on trees or the ground, or lily pads to jump across water. It's a really fun mechanic, even though it's not always accurate with the analog stick. Not sure how it would be with a motion controller as I don't have a PS Move. The brush does help by snapping to certain things, like to you and the floating flowers or hooks if you needed to use the vine swing ability. But I've had times where I've tried to make a lily pad but had the wind blow instead. These aren't issues or problems, but they are things you may run into while playing the game, as you may have to do a perspective check with the camera, as what may look good to you may not work as planned since you're putting a 2D image in a 3D world.
I like the celestial brush. It really gives you that God feeling of performing miracles and vanquishing evil, and the game does a really amazing job of making you feel the difference you're making.
And the celestial brush does really add to combat, giving some interesting tactics, like making a cherry bomb that you know the monster is going to run into, or making some trees to pop up that they'll smack into, and some enemies need you to use the brush on them to expose their weakness. It's a very unique way of battling instead of just mashing the square button over and over, but you don't want to go overboard with it. The ink pots do refill, but they take a while and each brush stroke you use takes one ink pot, and when you run out you can't use the celestial brush, and you can't use your weapons until the ink recharges. But I don't think there's really going to be anything to worry about as enemies drop ink pots almost constantly, and when it comes to bosses, it's only required to expose their weakness before you can wail on them. There is some platforming and it's done pretty well. There isn't that much of it, but it is fun, especially when the celestial brush plays a role in it. Jumping doesn't carry much momentum even if you're running as fast as you can, but you do get a lot of height, so I guess it's an even trade-off. And it lends to some really good exploring. You can search pretty much everything and there's a lot to explore. You'll find money, food for the food pouch, treasure, and beads, and if you collect 100 of them, you can become invincible.
There's just so much stuff to do. The game is about 40 plus hours, so if you want to finish it in a weekend, you're going to need a case of Red Bull and a colostomy bag.
There is a main story, but there's a lot of things to do on the side, like restoring withered trees and helping people with their problems. The background of the story itself is based on the defeat of the Japanese dragon, Yamata no Orochi, an 8-headed, 8-tailed snake-like dragon. It does take several creative liberties with it, like including the Shinto sun goddess and goddess of the universe, Amaterasu, who takes on the form of a wolf in the fight. Such other creative liberties are Susanoo, the Shinto god of the storms, being a mortal man named Susanoo. If you really want to learn more about who the characters are based on, I suggest looking up the Shinto religion, as that's where this game's lore heavily borrows from, and you'll pretty much get the basic gist of the story from there. And if you've played the Legend of Zelda games where Ganon is the antagonist, you'll get an idea of the goal and how things play out. What I mean by that is that it plays well with the atmosphere. You know there's evil about, but you can't see it, but you can feel its influence it has over the land, much like how Ganon's presence can be felt in the Zelda games, although it's not as immediate as Okami.
And that's why I'm not going to explain the story. It's like playing a game based on World War II. If you know the source material, you know how it's going to end.
The story is very well written, but it's really more about the characters than the overall stop the bad guy. We have Susanoo coming to terms with who he is. There's a kid who I forget his name becoming more responsible instead of running away all the time, just to name a few. You see more than the influence of a god destroying evil. You see how that influence helps people develop as they accomplish feats they never thought they could, which gives them the confidence to grow on their own. However, that doesn't mean all the characters are good. Susanoo is a pain in the ass for the most part, as he throws around his heritage and claims to be the greatest warrior who ever lived, to which I wouldn't find as annoying if his sword wasn't made of wood. And I know in Japan wooden swords are called bokken, and are used for training purposes and can be lethal in the hands of a trained expert. But I find it hard to take the character serious, even when he lives up to his legacy. This game even has its equivalent to Navi from Ocarina of Time in the form of his son, and he's just as annoying as Navi, but in different ways, as being an Electra's pervert.
But that comes from a cultural perspective. Characters who are annoying to Americans may be funny to people in Japan. Or Americans who watch way too much anime and think that's how Japan really is.
I don't understand how Okami was a commercial failure when it was a critical success. How this game didn't sell well and doesn't sell well by the droves is beyond me, as everyone knows that it's a really good game. It was advertised a lot, and from what I can remember, I couldn't open a gaming magazine without seeing an ad for it. As I said earlier, because the game didn't sell well, it was essentially the game that made Capcom decide to close their doors on Clover Studio, and God Hand was hardly advertised at all, essentially proving that they gave up on the developer because you can tell how much faith the publisher has in a game just by how much they advertise it. I played Okami on the PS2 back when it came out, and I can't remember if I bought it or borrowed it from a friend. It's a game that I can't recommend enough. If I were to put together a top 10 list of the greatest games ever made, Okami would be on that list. This game is a work of art, and if you have a PS3, and given that most of you do, as my PSN friends list is much larger than my Xbox Live and Nintendo Networks lists combined, you should be buying this game right now. It's $13, which is cheap considering that a physical copy still sells from $20 to $50. Strangely, the PS3 HD Remaster is a digital-only title in America and Europe, while everywhere else comes on a disc.
And here's where I tell you that this dark cloud has a silver lining. Unfortunately, no. It doesn't, as Capcom, in their infinite wisdom, decided to abandon the series.
A sequel to Okami was made, called Okami Den, which involves the children of the characters from Okami, but it was released for the DS. It was received well, but from what I read, it was really more of a portable version of the first game, as the gameplay and story elements were similar, but reviewers of that game did say how much it shows a complete package the first one was. I think that a proper sequel to Okami could be done. There's a lot in Japanese mythology that they could take stories from, like God of War and how much it borrows from Greek mythology, and there are several games in that franchise. I don't see Okami Den as a true sequel because it seems more like a spin-off. It's sad that Capcom didn't seize the opportunity to make Okami into a series that could truly rival the Legend of Zelda games, but I can understand them not doing so due to the low sales. But there are game series that really didn't take off until the sequel. Like, I don't know, Mega Man. The first game sold poorly, and it wasn't until the second where it saw success. Same with the first Street Fighter not being much of a success, and it wasn't until Street Fighter 2 where that series became the juggernaut it is today. Coincidentally, those two games, like Okami, are Capcom games, with Mega Man being another one of their abandoned series.
Okami is one of those games that you absolutely need to own. It's an amazing game, and if you don't have a PS3, get one and download the HD remaster.